LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, for me, it's been Barnier Day here in Brussels. A long day, a cold, freezing day on the streets of Brussels, and it all culminated at 11 o'clock this morning as I walked into the Berlaymont building, known here as the Burley Monster, this huge building, which is the HQ of the European Commission. The European Commission, who are the guardians of the European treaties and effectively are the government of Europe. This was the meeting with Michel Barnier. He's the European Union's chief Brexit negotiator, and I'd asked for it back in October after I'd seen Sir Nick Clegg, well, he wasn't Sir then, but he is now, Lord Adonis and Ken Clarke going in for a meeting, and I began to wonder, was anybody going in to see Barnier genuinely representing the views of 17.4 million people who voted to leave? So that was the genesis of the idea. I wrote to him, I read that letter out on this show. He responded by saying he'd meet me in the bar. I said, well, hang on a second, I think really we ought to have a better, more formal chat. And in the end, the 8th of January was agreed as the day. And all of these events, me going into the building, leaving the building, you can see by going to LBC's Instagram account, and also to my Instagram account, and you'll see a little film video there, collage, if you like, of much of what I did today. It was surprising in one way, and it showed, I guess, the extent to which he didn't really want to meet me, that no photographs were allowed at all. And indeed, my LBC producer and colleague, who came into the building with me, was ushered in a different direction. And the last time I saw him, he was sort of behind a glass screen. I thought perhaps we'd never ever see him again. They didn't want a photograph of the handshake or the meeting, which of course is in quite a big contrast to when the others have been. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn even gave him an Arsenal football shirt with Barnier written on it, so they didn't want that to happen. However, he was proper, he was polite, and much to my surprise, he even offered me coffee. Now, this is interesting, because I've learnt through life that if you go to a meeting and coffee is not offered, it's either because you're about to get the sack or you're in for a serious rollicking. You know, interviews without coffee are never particularly friendly experiences. But this time, he did offer me coffee, which is rather nice, actually. And we sat and we talked. And as I'd promised over the course of the last few days, we would, using the hashtag Ask Barnier, go through the thousands of requests and questions that you sent us. I mean, not all of them were very nice and clean, but a hell of a lot were. And we'd pick out 3, and we'd use that as a framework for the entire discussion. So I walked in with a file under my arm, with pages and pages of stats, lots of research, lots of background, but the first page in the file was the LBC Ask Barnier questions. So I started off by getting the question that Paul had sent in. And I asked him whether he understood why 52% of people had defied not just the British political elite or the European political elite, but of course if you include Obama and virtually everybody else, why they defied the global elite and voted for Brexit. And I thought the answer to this was really very, very telling indeed. Because, and Stuart on Facebook says, did you really get answers you didn't already know? Well, Stuart, listen to this. Because I wasn't quite sure how he'd answer this question. I wasn't actually quite sure. I said, you know, did he understand what the main driving force behind the Brexit vote had been? And I'm just looking at my notes here. You know, basically he said, well, of course, 350 million a week was promised for the NHS, if you remember the famous Boris bus that drove around the country. And he genuinely seemed to be confused as to why people had voted for Brexit. He thought that the Leave side had frankly not told the truth. And it's kind of in line a bit with what you hear from UK Remainers, that somehow there was this massive lie told during the referendum, and even if 350 million a week was rather optimistic, it was in the right direction of travel. And I said to him, but surely, Monsieur Barnier, don't you understand that actually open-door immigration. And it wasn't the reason that everyone who voted leave, but it was an absolute main driver that got people out on polling day. And he almost didn't believe it. He said, well, I can understand why immigration from outside the EU was an issue at the time, but he didn't get that once we'd let in 10 former communist countries, this had become a really big issue. We then moved on to Sergio's question about trade, what was going to happen with the EU economy, if a deal wasn't secured, given, and as I said to him, you do sell us a lot of motor cars, wine and chocolate, and indeed that's true. Cheese, of course, could be added in as well. And on that, well, I'll go in to more detail on that over the course of the next hour. But when it comes to trading goods, it's pretty straightforward, I think, in his opinion, to have a deal. When it comes to trade or a deal on services, particularly financial services, it gets a lot more complicated. And finally, James's question, was Monsieur Barnier keen to see the continuation of mass immigration into the nations of the EU? If so, why does he support such measures? Well, to be honest with you, James, he did his best not really to talk about that. He really diverted from that and said, look, whatever happened with Brexit, we've learnt the lessons, we're moving on, we're going to have a common immigration policy, a European army, we have Monsieur Macron elected in France. Basically what he was saying was it's full steam ahead. And I said, but what about the Prime Minister of Hungary and indeed Poland, who are standing up and saying, hey, we've got a real problem with this, and he just didn't recognise that. So tell me, are you, with what I've given you so far, and a lot more detail over the course of the next 3/4 of an hour, but tell me, with what I've said so far, are you happy with the answers that Michel Barnier gave you today? And I'm going to go first to Robert. He's in the northeast in South Shields, a new caller to the show. Robert, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you? You all right?
Well, I'm fine. It's been quite a long day, a fascinating day, and as I said to Stuart on Facebook, I did actually learn a few things today. I mean, I learnt that actually, Robert, this issue of immigration, it isn't just British politicians that want to brush it under the carpet and pretend it's not happening. It happens here in Brussels too.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. I was looking at the Brexit. I mean, I voted out for Brexit. For years prior to joining the common market, England traded with the whole world quite happily. And why can't we do it again? And I look at the EU and the way they're carrying on, and they're just like a pack of school bullies. And they're like a wall. You can't negotiate with a wall. And I just wonder if the Tory government are all walking around with bandages on their foreheads, trying to bang their heads against this wall to get their own way, and they can't. It's absolutely crazy.
I think, Robert, the truth of it is that the Prime Minister is really very keen to get a deal. Certainly, the big businesses and the big banks are saying, without a deal, it'll be a disaster. Bear in mind that China and the USA trade with European countries without any trade deal. It's just that if a good or a product or a service looks to be reliable enough and at the right price, people will still buy it. And what's happened here, Robert, is that in phase one of these negotiations, the British government have conceded really quite a lot, in the hope that in phase two, things will get better. And kind of what I learned today, Robert, was that, as I say, when it comes to chocolate and cheese and cars and wine, Monsieur Barnier is really happy to have a trade deal, rather like the Canada deal. Well, of course he is, because they sell us £70 billion worth of goods more every year than we sell them. So from his perspective, Robert, what's not to like? But then when we moved on to financial services, the bit where we make money out of our relationship with Europe, well, then I can tell you the whole tone changed. And in fact, I would honestly say that he was so intransigent, effectively, on that, that I begin to wonder whether, Robert, it's actually worth us going through the next sort of 14, 15 months of negotiations and ratification. I begin to think that some business people will start to lose patience with this and will start to say, do you know what, maybe better we just leave on WTO rules. And I did say, Robert, to Barnier, in line with Sergio's question, that if this happened, it would disproportionately hurt European exporters and European financial institutions more than it would us. So that's kind of how it went.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that the Europeans are just going to try and get it all their own way. We're going to be shortchanged, really. Our government are just appeasing. They're just not standing up for themselves or us in particular in any way, shape or form. I think they want is it right that they want a parallel agreement alongside what's currently there? That's how I read it, which is not really Brexit in the slightest. It's more...
No, one thing that was interesting, Robert, talking to Barnier about business and financial markets, he believes that if all the rules are the same, it'll somehow be a better world. And I believe in competition. I think actually slight differences in tax and in regulation can in fact make the marketplace healthier. Robert, do you think we're near the point where we should simply walk away?
Oh, we should have walked away at the start. I come from a country that's so regulated by the EU when we're trying to trade. It's unreal. And I knew this was going to happen. Straight up, New Zealand.
New Zealand, well, in terms of agricultural produce and quotas all of that.
I was a dairy farmer out there, and we used to get the EU coming around inspecting, and the silly things they'd pull you up on was unbelievable, horrific. And I knew this was going to happen. They were just going to be objectionable and put objection after objection after objection in the way. And at the start, there's just no point in negotiate. We should just literally gone to WTO rules and sobbed a lot of them and get on with it. It was simple as that.
Well, we are before the watershed, so we're slightly careful, Robert, with our language, but as a frustrated New Zealand dairy farmer, we will kind of allow you that. No, I mean, look, they are in many ways the big bully, and that's kind of how they behave. Robert, I thank you for your call and for your experience in dealing with the European Union, and we will, in a moment, we're going to get James on, who sent us that third question about whether Barnier was keen to see a continuation of mass immigration into the nations, and I want all of you, please respond positively or negatively to what I've heard from Mr. Barnier today. You can do that by calling 0345 60 60 973. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, live from the European Parliament here in Brussels, and it's 7:15. I asked you to send me questions, and I said I'd select 3 of them out of the thousands that came in, and I would put them to the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier. And one of those who sent in a question that got chosen was James from Worcester. And he's on the line now. Good evening, James.
Good evening, Nigel. Good to be with you.
Good. No, and thank you for participating in this. So your question, James, was, is Monsieur Barnier keen to see the continuation of mass immigration into the nations of the EU? And if so, why does he support such measures? So, James, I absolutely faithfully did put that question to him, and Barnier's response was that they've learnt the lessons from Brexit. They now have a new political agenda they will build without the United Kingdom, and he said that we should listen to what Macron is saying and to what Juncker is saying. And I said, well, why don't you listen to what Viktor Orban's saying and others are saying when they're saying, actually, these numbers are too great, it's too difficult to assimilate, and we won't accept EU quotas. And I got the feeling, James, that he was in denial over this. What he did, I tell you what he did in the earlier part of the meeting, talk about that was interesting. He talked about a poster that I used during the campaign, which of course was about this very subject you've asked the question on. And he did kind of admit that there was some deep concern back in 2015-16 about the EU's it's their common asylum policy, actually. But he kind of said, it doesn't matter anymore, we're heading to the sunlit uplands, it's going to be great, we're going to have new policies, an EU army, and what's there to worry about? That, James, was your answer.
Well, he seems to have sort of fobbed us all off with the usual platitudes. The reason I asked the question was I wanted to know really to what extent he would acknowledge the issue, and he sort of touched on it without really going into any depth, and to what extent that he and the rest of the Commission and the rest of the kind of European political elite, if you like, were complicit in changing Europe for their own political and financial gain. And as far as I can see it, I think there's an issue with not just the EU attempting to dissolve the nation state in creating a more federalised, therefore centralised Europe, but but also changing the culture of Europe as well. The European culture, whether it be Slavic or Anglo-Saxon or whatever, it's more a question of breaking down existing societies through enforced multiculturalism. At whose behest is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a sense, Tony Blair was ahead of these guys, wasn't he? Because it was Blair's government in 1997, and I quote one of his advisors, who wanted to rub the noses of the right in diversity. Well, they sure did that in many towns and cities in the United Kingdom. One quick point, James, I'll pick up on the use of the words federal. If it was a genuinely federal Europe, where the member states had considerable power over their lives, a bit like, say, the states in the USA, but things were done together at the centre that were thought that could only be done at that level, that'd be one model. But actually, Barnier and I did talk about the word federal, and we did talk about the word, centralised, and it's very, very clear, James, that they are not building a federal Europe. They are building in fact, a unitary Europe run by the institutions based here in Brussels with their satellites in Strasbourg and Luxembourg. And I don't know. I personally am convinced that as the course of not just our Brexit negotiations, but the course of the next few years go on, my feeling, James, is that people in all the countries of Europe will say, hey, we don't want all this centralisation of power. We want to make some more decisions over our own lives.
Exactly. As a libertarian and a member of the UK Libertarian Party, I believe that power and democracy works best when it's devolved down to the very lowest levels. What we get with the EU is the exact opposite of that. It's a centralisation of power. You're concentrating power in just a few hands, and that results in political and economic chaos. And that can be shown throughout history.
And resentment too. James, listen, thank you for coming on the line. Thank you for your question. And it certainly provoked a very interesting response that was close to denial. Barnier and the EU strategy is to scare the living daylights out of any other country that decides to make a dash for freedom, says Richard. Well, Richard, he said repeatedly to me, that we're not trying to exact retribution. That's what he said. And yet, he's been doing a pretty good job of it so far, doesn't he? Barnier seems genuinely ignorant, which is a problem. How can he negotiate with a group that he can't understand, says Chris. Well, I think, and actually, Chris, I'm not so sure we should blame just Barnier for this. I genuinely do not believe that the British government so far in these negotiations have even really raised the issue of open-door immigration and what our future relationship is going to be between us and the rest of the European Union. When I talked about that, he gave me the impression that all of this will be dealt with at some point in the future. So I think the disconnect isn't so much between the British government and Mr. Barnier, it's between the Brexit voters and Mr. Barnier. At least that is my impression of what I saw today. On Twitter, I get the only people who are confused about why the UK voted to leave are those who voted to leave. Whoever you are, I don't really agree with that. People who voted to leave had different priorities. That's certainly true. But if you look at all the polling leading up to and during that referendum, it was this question. Not of stopping immigration. I was accused by Lord Adonis today, Nigel wanted to stop all immigration. I've never said that. But it was about having a degree of control, which as EU members we simply couldn't have. Let's go to Angus in Whitechapel. Good evening, Angus.
All right, Nigel, how's it going? So I just wanted to pick up on your point about open-door immigration being a driver for Leave voters, and sort of the context of this. And maybe you need to be asking yourself some deeper questions. Since the dawn of time, competition for scarce resources, hostility has been driven by competition for scarce resources between groups, yeah? So, back in the day, it would have been between fertile land, resources. Now you're doing it between jobs. So you and the Leave campaign and the tabloid media for the whole year before the referendum vote were driving this intergroup hostility around jobs and around competition for our resources in Europe. And I think it's pathetic that in the 21st century we can't get away from such a basic thing that's been going on for years and years and centuries. Why has that still got to be a driver for people? Why are you and the Leave campaign using that rhetorically to create, to divide people, really?
Okay, all right. No, you've made your point, and I understand how, you believe in that very strongly. Can I ask you a question in return? Would you agree that this is about a question of scale? That when you think about it, one of the things I first said when I came to this place in 1999 and started to travel around Europe quite a lot is I genuinely believed, and I said, that I thought the United Kingdom had the best race relations and the most integrated immigrant communities of any country in Europe. And I know that...
Great, so what's the problem?
Okay, here's the kicker, right?
We're integrated, we all get together, we're a multicultural society. So what's the issue? I don't see the issue with immigration. Why is it such a problem for people?
Because from 1951 until 1999, net migration into the United Kingdom had averaged 30,000 people a year. And then it got completely out of control with Blair, with the admission of 8, then 10 former communist countries. And it's gone up in the biggest years to 1,300,000 a year, 10 times the number that we were used to dealing with through all of those interwar years. And I think, Angus, honestly, if we hadn't had that level of immigration, there would never have been a referendum. And if the European Commission and Council had made... Hang on. Had they made concessions to Cameron in that renegotiation, then the Remain side would have won. And that, Angus, is how strongly and how angry people all over the country feel about this.
Yeah, but Nigel, Cameron himself commissioned research showing that net migration's had a net benefit to the UK. There's so much research showing that there's much more of a benefit than it is a disadvantage. I mean, I'm sure you know that. Your mate Donald Trump right now is being told on his closed-door immigration policy, actually, it's a bad idea. We need a lot of skilled labour to come in, Donald. We shouldn't be doing this. It's not a good idea. The Silicon Valley guys are telling him that, and he's caught in two minds. We're going to be in exactly the same position once we've left. People telling Theresa May, if we're closing the door on immigration, then we're actually... No,
Angus, you mustn't do this. You mustn't do this, otherwise you're joining the Lord Adonis camp. Nobody on the Brexit side said, let's put up the drawbridge. What we said is let's control who's allowed to come across the drawbridge, and they are two very different things. And I would, Angus, say to you, right at the moment, we have a huge NHS winter crisis. That, I put to you, Angus, is actually the result of a population crisis, of the fact that this country's population is rising by up to 500,000 people every year. Angus, we're not anti-immigrant. We're about control. Is that not, I put it to you, a reasonable position?
They're going to be made. All right.
Sorry.
We'll agree to disagree, Nigel, but you know...
All right, well, listen, I tell you what, we've done so in a very civil way, and that's what LBC allows us to do. Proper democratic debate. Angus, I thank you for making your heartfelt points. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, live from the European Parliament building in Brussels. It's now 7:30. Well, I've been on Brexit business here in Brussels, but a lot has been going on in Downing Street today. A lot of comings and goings, and I have to admit, I'm a little bit behind the curve as to what's happened. So to help us through today's story, the reshuffle that in many ways was being branded as the diversity reshuffle, is it, isn't it? Well, to help us through this is LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood. Good evening, Theo.
Good evening, Nigel. The diversity shuffle that never was. It's white, male and pale and very, very stale. Theresa May has ducked the big choices, and at the moment, Nigel, there is a ginormous row taking place in Downing Street between Justine Greening, the Education Secretary, the Prime Minister and her advisers, because of course it had been briefed over the weekend that Justine Greening was going to lose her job at Education. She was then offered the Department of Work and Pensions because, of course, David Gawker's the DWP Secretary has gone over to Justice to replace David Liddington. It's like the Titanic with deck chairs. And now she's refused that offer of the DWP, Nigel, and she's been ensconced in there. This is Justine Greening for 2 hours. Yeah. Usually these things take about 10 minutes, but we've yet to hear whether she's resigned from the government. That's the rumour currently swirling around.
This is not the smack of firm leadership, is it, Theo?
No, you're quite right to pick up on the narrative. Of course, reshuffle's all about setting your tone from a Prime Minister's point of view for the government, setting your agenda, what you're going to do, strong leadership, strong and stable leadership as the moniker from Theresa May's general election campaign, and at the moment it is looking decidedly weak and wobbly. Jeremy Hunt refused to go to business. Greg Clark, who is regarded as a ditherer at business, was set to lose his job, but in actual fact he's going to stay at business. And so Theresa May, having wanted to make some changes, spruce things up a bit, well, now it's all looking very much the same old.
Now, I was in between interviews, and somebody whispered in my ear, Chris Grayling has just become the Conservative Party chairman. I said, oh, well, actually, I know Chris Grayling likes grassroots campaigning. Perhaps he'd be well suited to it. And then I sort of picked up 15 minutes later that actually Chris Grayling wasn't going to become party chairman. What on earth happened there?
At the perils of Twitter, Nigel. The BBC got a bit ahead of itself and confirmed that Chris Grayling was going to become the new Conservative Party chairman. In fact, there were rumours going around, but it hadn't been confirmed. Then a staffer within the Tory Party press office picked it up and confirmed it on Twitter under the Conservatives' official Twitter handle.
You couldn't make this up, could you?
It then got WhatsApp to every MP. It was then deleted, the tweet this is, 27 seconds later. It is the fastest job appointment and job loss, I think, in political reshuffle history.
All I can say is no wonder Barnier is running rings round them, because whether I agree with Barnier or not, he's certainly on top of his brief. Of that, I was left in no doubt today at all. Well, it sounds like a little bit of a farce, but can I just end, Theo, on a slightly more serious point? I understand that James Brokenshire has stood down for health reasons.
Yes, he's going to have an operation. A lesion has been found on one of his lungs, and he's going to have an operation within the next couple of weeks. Of course, for the departments, it's a critical time because Northern Ireland is teetering on the return of direct rule. But personally, for James Brokenshire, I'm sure all of your listeners at LBC and everyone at LBC wishes him the very speediest of recoveries.
Absolutely. Theo, thank you. And yes, to repeat that point, we wish James Brokenshire well. We really, really do. Now, my next caller has been waiting on the line for ages. I apologise for that. Will from Evesham, you're on. You've been very patient. What do you make of what I've had in my discussions with Barnier today?
Yeah, no problem, Nigel. Thanks for having me on. I just think, you've gone over there some kind of honest broker to find out what he's got to say. When actually you're anything but. You're spreading the usual propaganda, you're distorting what is said, and you're trying to manipulate people. Just a couple of examples to highlight on your show this evening, which I think just absolutely outrageous. To imply that the crisis in the NHS is immigrant-driven is outrageous. I've got in front of me the ONS stats.
Will, hang on. No, Will, I said, no, I'm going to correct you. I said we have a population crisis. Is that unreasonable?
Yeah, no, come on. There you go. The clear link. You were discussing immigration, and then you tried to link that to say, and we've got an NHS crisis going on, and the clear point being, it's because of uncontrolled immigration. The ONS, as shown, shows that the immigrations tend to be between 20 to 36 years of old. Hardly the people who are going to be causing this great drain on the NHS. Anything but. Those people are coming in to work and to contribute. They're not coming in to be a drain. The drain on the NHS, as we know, is because we've got an ageing population where we need immigration. The other one, quite rightly, Barnier pointed out that poster. We remember that poster, Nigel. That poster was reminiscent of Nazi Germany. That was the one that Hitler was using to scaremonger about the Jews. And you outrageously use the same poster and to try and imply this is a fair example.
No. Will, I didn't use. Will, let's be straight about this. We didn't use any artwork at all in that poster. We used a photograph because it was factual. And wasn't it interesting, Will? If you study that photograph, how many women are there? How many children are there? How many disabled people are there? It was all young males using the Merkel madness to try to get into Europe, and it was, I think, a very big political mistake.
Well, the other thing you failed to mention tonight in your show, you know, when you were talking about, well, we should just go to WHO rules and we'll just lose. And exactly how is that going to work in Northern Ireland then?
Well, you're right. That is a very complex issue, and we do need to get onto that. But would you agree, Will? Do you know what? Bertie Ahern, the former Taoiseach, said, yes, we can sort Northern Ireland now. I personally believe, Will, and it's very interesting because the Taoiseach is coming to the European Parliament in Strasbourg next week. I personally believe that what we ought to do, because of political sensitivity, is we should go to Barnier and say, look, however these negotiations work out or don't work out, can we please have your permission to allow Ireland to continue to have a tariff-free deal with the United Kingdom, because that way, we've got a much easier transition through to the next phase. To make an exception for Ireland, I would suggest, Will, is the really grown-up way of dealing with this.
Really, and so you're ignoring Barney's not your problem there, Nigel. The DUP are. That's exactly what they said they won't have. They will not.
Oh, no. That's not true. That's not true.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Well, so the DUP are happy for Ireland to be treated different to the rest of the UK, then, are they? No. Will, the deal would not be just with Northern Ireland, it would be with the United Kingdom, because the key point here is a lot of Irish goods that go to Europe, although Europe is not a big marketplace for Ireland, but a lot of Irish goods that go to Europe are transshipped through the whole of the United Kingdom. So that, we would be, if we were able to get this, we would solve the problem. In conclusion, Will, what do you want to see? What do you want to see for these? What do you want to see from these negotiations? What I want to see is some honesty, okay? So you talk about the business community, again, in your show. The business community overwhelmingly think leaving is utter madness, all right? It is going to cost us, anything up to, 40, 50 billion just to leave, let alone all the other costs. Okay, and you keep quoting as if the majority. Can I just point out, it was over 70% of the population either voted against or didn't vote. So this 17 million...
You can argue that. You can argue that with any election or any referendum. Well, I will say this to you. The voices we've heard and the voices that have dominated from business thus far in the media have come, you're quite right, from the big banks, Goldman Sachs and some of the big multinationals.
Well, hang on.
No. I mean, Goldman Sachs are there everywhere. Well, I tell you what, wait for this Wednesday. This Wednesday, there is a delegation now going in to see Barnier. I hope I've set a trend here. And among them will be Lord Digby Jones, the former boss of the CBI, and John Longworth, the former boss of the British Chambers of Commerce. And I'll be very interested to see what they have to say when they come out, because I have a sense, Will, that this debate is about to change. I really do, because I think that what is going to happen, unless we see there is the possibility at the end of a lot of hard work of a really grown-up deal that includes both goods and services, I think you'll start to see businesses breaking ranks and saying, let's go to WTO rules, let's simply get on with it. And that's one of the... Well, as ever, I thank you for your call. We're never going to agree, but hey, that is fine. And really, to rather back me up, Shaz on Facebook says, isn't there going to be a no-deal minister in today's reshuffle? Well, we were expecting, Shaz, the reshuffle to be over by now, but according to Theo, there's a great big Barney going on. But yes, the Prime Minister is going to appoint a no-deal minister, and that, I think, is very good news, because I think she's hearing the same business voices that I'm hearing. They may be below the radar at this moment in time, but there is no point wasting years of our time if there's not even the realistic prospect of getting a proper deal at the end of this. The UK government, thus far in these negotiations, has given. To move on from here, and I think too much, but hey, we are where we are. But to move on from here, we're going to need to see Barnier make some concessions. We really, really are. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, live from the European Parliament in Brussels, and it's 7:45. I took 3 of your questions to Monsieur Barnier, the European Union's chief Brexit negotiator today, and the first question I took was from Paul. Paul lives on the Isle of Wight, and he's on the line now. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Nigel, and thank you very much for putting my question forward.
Well, I can assure you, Paul, there were thousands of great questions. You got picked, but it was the simplicity, I think, of your question. Did you hear what I said earlier on in the show? And just to remind listeners, Paul's question was, ask Mr. Barnier if he understands why the majority of British people voted to leave the European Union. And I put it to him, Paul, and basically he said because they were told a pack of lies about $350 million a week. And when I mentioned open-door immigration, he looked somewhat bemused. Paul?
Absolutely, and I don't think that he or Monsieur Juncker, President Juncker, or President Tusk, or any of the other people in the EU fully understand why people voted to leave the economic union of Europe. And that is a prime question, and I can't see how people can negotiate without actually doing their research, talking to the British people who voted to leave, and actually understanding the nature of the problems that we suffer from over here.
Well, see, the point is, Paul, he thinks he has spoken to the representatives. He said to me, I've met members of the House of Lords, I've met MPs, I've met Brexit people. So he feels he's spoken to a cross-section of the United Kingdom and that they have not impressed upon him the importance of him. And I do believe, look, there were lots of reasons, Paul, that we voted to leave, but hey, immigration was, having control of it, was the big driver. But he's having a conversation with the political class. He's not having a conversation with Joe Public, is he?
Absolutely, and the people who actually voted for Brexit. And this is something which it seems to me is absolutely essential. You raise the 2 points, immigration and also self-determination in government. These are two very, very important things.
Yes. Yeah, do you know, Paul, there was a moment there when he was talking about the economics and the risks of being out and what it might mean for our future, blah, blah, blah. And I said, but do you understand, Mr. Barnier, that this wasn't a purely economic debate? It was about democracy. It was about self-determination. It was about who we are as a nation and our place in the world. And that argument, Paul, maybe we should be using that argument more, when we have the pleasure of talking to the Lord Adonises or whoever it may be. They try and reduce everything to an economic argument. Their track record on this is abysmal, because all this mob wanted us to join the euro, and thank God we didn't. And maybe, Paul, we need to be a bit stronger about this self-determination point, do you think?
Absolutely. We need to be in control of immigration, of many other aspects, including our justice system, so that we can get a better future and a better control on the way that Great Britain proceeds to the future.
Well, I believe that too, Paul. I thank you for coming on the line. I thank you for your question and participating in this. Well done. Thank you. Moving rapidly on to get a few more calls in. Ryan, a new caller from Islington, is on the line. Good evening, Ryan.
Hi there. I never thought, Nigel, I'd say I was looking forward to listening to you tonight, but I must say tonight I really was, because I thought those 3 questions, although I might have asked something different, were actually quite interesting. I was looking forward to hearing the answer to them. But I've got to say, I'm sure I speak for a lot of listeners at the moment, I cannot believe how much you've just used the answer to just preach to the choir. You've got, I presume, pretty comprehensive answers from this man in Brussels, and all you've done is just spun them and shortened them. You've not bothered to give us any sort of neutral representation of how the conversation went. And I think it's absolutely appalling. I think you should be ashamed.
I have, Ryan, 100% done my best to give you a completely accurate representation of the conversation I've had with Monsieur Barnier. I've not been rude about him at any point. He is a very courteous man. He is a man who believes in the European project. He believes in it like a religion. And of course, I take a very different perspective. And, I want a Europe where we trade together, cooperate together. I believe the nation states cooperating is the model. He believes Brussels and effectively a United States of Europe is the way to proceed. So all of this was conducted in a civil way. You can only take my word for it, but I'm telling you honestly how these questions were answered. That is the view that he takes.
will you be releasing some sort of transcript? Will there be any way we can see what was actually said? Because I'm not doubting the conversation was civil. I'm not doubting that at all. I think as much as I disagree with nearly everything you say, I think you're very articulate. I think you have the capability to let us know as the British public what was actually said in those conversations. But all you've given is this little short morsels. And your previous caller was elated with basically you barely answering the question.
Well, I tell you what. I tell you what, Ryan. I tell you what you can do. You can contact Mr. Barnier's office and ask him, because he refused to have a photograph with me. He won't be putting out any transcript. There wasn't any official recording, but we did take absolutely copious notes. I had a legal representative of mine in with me. We took copious notes of the entire conversation, and I genuinely, Ryan, believe what I'm telling you to be an accurate record and true. I wish I could have come tonight onto LBC to say, do you know what, guys? I'm really optimistic that we're going to move on to a rounded deal on goods and services, because short-term, that'll make life very easy, would allow us to get out and pursue our global vision. I didn't get that. It doesn't exist. Believe me, Ron. You may not, but believe me, that is the truth. I'm going to go to Christine. Now. I've got to get some more callers in. Time is running out. I'm going to go to Christine, who's a new caller from Wallington. Good evening, Christine.
Hello, Nigel.
Good evening.
Good evening. It's the first time I've ever phoned any chat show, but no, I am the granddaughter of Italian immigrants who came over in 1911. And I have no problem with immigration, but it needs to be controlled. It needs to be controlled. So that people
Christine,
can integrate.
Christine, so, my day started, Christine, on breakfast television, standing in a freezing cold street. They kept me there for 20 minutes. My feet had gone numb. And we had Piers Morgan, and he was sort of invigilating a debate between me and Lord Adonis. And Adonis said, Nigel Farage wants to end all immigration. Christine, believe me, the Brexit vote was never, ever about completely pulling up the drawbridge. It was about control.
Absolutely. It was never about stopping immigration. It was about, I am a total Brexiteer. It was never about stopping immigration. It's about controlling it. My dad, according to my DNA profile, I'm 83% Italian. But my dad joined the RAF in the Second World War because I don't want anybody to say that my mum is not patriotic. And he was in the RAF. So, I love this country. It's given me an education. It's given me a living. And I love it. And I just get so upset with people.
Christine, as a fabulous testimonial, you've made the point on immigration, how we feel, beautifully. And I can tell you, as you're 83% Italian, as it were, watch the Italian elections. They're coming up in the second week of March. They could be a big change. I've got time for one last caller this evening. It's Natalie, another new caller to the show, and she's calling from Hackney. Good evening, Natalie.
Hiya. I just wanted to pick up on a particular one point that you made earlier when you were talking about the poster you had during Brexit, and you were saying you're asking where all the women and children, where are the disabled people in that picture?
Abandons the answer, I think.
Well, no, I don't think that is quite right, actually. And I think it's often misunderstood, and it can really inflame a lot of prejudice and resentment, which isn't quite right. Because if somebody is... So that journey is so dangerous and so risky, and you have no idea where you're going, that for the people that make it, it's only strong young men that survive that journey with the hope that they may get somewhere. It's unlike we see how many people die in the Mediterranean, but with the hope that they get somewhere and can then bring their family with them. So to kind of imply that, it's just men out for themselves, abandoning their families, it's unfair. It shows a real lack of understanding.
Do you know what, Natalie?
And it stirs up unfair tension towards this.
Do you know what, Natalie? Even the European Commission in 2016 admitted that only 20% of those that had come, of that column and other columns like it, only 20% of them would ever have qualified for refugee status in any traditional role. But Natalie, I take the point. We have to be responsible about these things. Look, my final thought on all of this today is that we really are, the Brexit voting public and Mr. Barnier are miles and miles apart. They don't really understand each other. I hope I'm wrong about a future trade deal, but it doesn't look very good to me. He doesn't want want to have a trade deal on financial services because he believes he must protect the stability of European financial markets. There you are. If you want to see how the day unfolded in pictures, go to the LBC website, lbc.co.uk, go to @LBC on Twitter, and of course you can follow LBC's Instagram story. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show on LBC, live from Brussels. I'm back